Morning, everybody.
Good morning. Howdy.
Howdy. I wouldn't normally say that, because I'm from New York. Somebody once said that life is a journey, not a destination. But actually, I believe it's both. It's a journey and a destination. I think it's very important to know where you're going and also how to get there. And if you don't set good, healthy, righteous goals, you might get way off. It doesn't take a lot of being off to end up in a completely bad and wrong place. And that's really the story of my life. I want to share a little bit about that with you guys this morning. I was tripping my brains out in 1978 on LSD. I felt like the walls were moving, the trees were saying howdy to me. The clouds were all moving, they looked like giant marshmallows, everything was in motion. And I was feeling a little bit distraught because I didn't understand what was going on. I lay down in a bathtub at a friend's house, fully clothed, and felt like my body was becoming the liquid in the tub that was filling it up. And I felt this strange feeling like floating in the bathtub, even though I was in there with no water. Well, I only realized that my body wasn't a liquid when a cat jumped on my chest and didn't sink. It was a revelation to me, that I was still solid and I was still okay, but I was still tripping and trying to understand what was going on in my life. How did I get into that bathtub? Well, it started in Queens, New York, where I'm originally from. And in Queens, I was raised in a typical middle-class Jewish family, a very liberal, dysfunctional middle-class Jewish family, I might add. And it was a classic, conflicted marriage. My parents were not happy with one another. My mother was very depressed about everything that was going on in her life. My dad was distant and aloof. Ultimately, he was cheating on my mother, and she didn't know it, and later on it completely blew up. But for me, it meant the end of a dream. The dream when I was a child was that I was going to be unconditionally loved, and everybody loved each other. My parents loved one in the family equally, and my brother and I have a younger brother by 2 years, would just get along without any trouble, without much conflict, without much difficulty. But my dreams started to go down the tubes quickly when I was about 18 years old, and this started to happen. And my emotional state in 1978 was anything but happy, anything but peaceful, anything but joyful. And I began to search. And my mother's a clinical psychologist, my dad's a CPA. I was taught, as a Jewish guy growing up, that through the study of knowledge, you could learn anything you needed to learn, you could accomplish anything you wanted to accomplish. So I set out to try to understand life. And that was a daunting challenge for me. I think it is for most people to understand life, the meaning and the purpose of life. Why am I here? What is the whole purpose of it? Was a mystery to me. It was an enigma. But I was determined to try to understand. And so I began reading psychology, religion, I began reading philosophy, and in college and in those types of classes I did fairly well. I started to accumulate a lot of intellectual information, but it really didn't do anything for me in terms of my general happiness. So my search continued, and one day I was flipping through the television stations, and I happened upon a show that maybe some of you have heard of called The 700 Club with Pat Robertson. It's one of the longest running Christian television shows on the air today. And on the show they had people giving their testimonies from all walks of life, people that were successful in business, successful as athletes, successful in just about every way, and also people sharing about miracles that had taken place in their lives. Being healed of cancer, all kinds of problems, and they would have testimony after testimony, and some of my old heroes actually turned out to be Christians and came on the program and gave their testimony, and I was shocked. Dr. Julius Erving, that I sort of worshipped as a kid, one of the greatest basketball players of all time, I thought at that time. That was him coming on the program saying that he believed this, that Jesus Christ died for his sins, was crucified, buried, and then rose again, to me was fantastic. It was unbelievable. Because here's a guy that had everything the world had to offer, and he was still saying this. Why would he need to know Jesus? It didn't make any sense to me. But it seemed to give some validity to the idea that Jesus really could be, as I was coming from this as a Jewish person, the Jewish Messiah, the Mashiach. Was it possible that Jesus, Yeshua, was really Messiah? And I was very, very provoked to search even deeper. So I began to study prophecy. I began to study the prophecies pertaining to Jesus as well as prophecies pertaining to Israel. And I discovered that God promised throughout the prophets that toward the last days that God would regather the Jewish people from all of the lands they had been dispersed, and he would reestablish Israel as a nation. And against the odds, with all the enemies that exist, that Israel has had to contend with throughout time, they still persisted, and sure enough, in 1948 they became a nation. In 1967, Israel established Jerusalem as its capital, and prophecy seemed to be in the process of being fulfilled right before my eyes. And so, on the 700 Club as well, they had Jewish believers coming on and saying that Jesus really was the Messiah. So I had all this exposure, and I was really trying to understand it. Ultimately, I did pray to receive Jesus as my personal Lord and Savior in the summer of 1978 with Pat Robertson. Then I was introduced to Christians. Everything that appeared to be so good on TV, on the show, where everybody loved each other and everyone was happy all the time, joyful, and seemed to have this peace that passed understanding, and everything that I was looking for, all of a sudden, the dream was shattered again. Not everybody loved everybody, not by a long shot. In fact, a lot of Christians had some very severe, deep, and profound problems. Some of them worse than mine, which I couldn't hardly believe, but it was obviously, it became very obvious to me that it was true. And I felt, in a sense, like I was betrayed. I trusted these Christians, and next thing I knew, they were lying to me, stealing from me, and rejecting me, and I felt like, okay, now I'm right back at square one as a believer, so where's God in all this? I couldn't understand it. Well, I decided in 1978, in the summer after I prayed to receive the Lord, that I would go up to State University of New York in Binghamton and try being a visiting student there. And what I didn't realize as I was hitching for a ride, that I was about to be picked up by a witch. And a witch introduced me to several other witches, and then sex, drugs, and rock and roll became a lifestyle. They were into not only drugs, but sorcery, and they were having wild orgies, and I didn't participate in a lot of it, but some of it I did. And I was very confused about what was right, what was wrong. I just wanted to feel better, and I was looking for just about anything that would make me feel better, even if I knew that according to the Bible it was something that you shouldn't do. So things that were clearly sin from God's point of view, from the Bible's point of view, I was willing to engage in because interacting with Christians didn't work. And so I was very disillusioned and still searching. I went to a church while I was in Binghamton, and I ended up, not without any discernment or judgment, I ended up picking a dead church. And when I went into the church, there was no one there, and there was no one to talk to, no one to listen to me, so I felt completely alone and alienated, and even more depressed than I was before I got there. So I come back from Binghamton, still very much depressed and confused about God, and searching. So I decided what I would do is go to a Bible college. That seemed to make sense. I was predisposed to trying to understand everything and try to figure things out. And so I figured if I went to school for it, then maybe I could understand God. I can't figure out the meaning and purpose of life, but maybe I can understand God, right? That's easier, I thought. And where else, would be a better place to do that than a Bible college? So I went to Northeastern Bible College. At that time, it was in Essex Fells, New Jersey. It's no longer there. But a lot of Jews for Jesus have gone there, and Chosen People Ministries, missionaries have been trained there. And I ran into one or two of them, but for the most part I was just a solitary Jewish guy, a little bit older than most of the kids that went there at that time, and didn't feel that I fit in at all. I was told before I got there that I couldn't watch the 700 Club on television. That was my only real fellowship, and that was keeping my faith in God alive. And they said you couldn't bring the TV because it was against the rules. So I brought it anyway and hid it under my typewriter cover. And I was still smoking wildly. I was smoking cigarettes. I was a chain smoker. I couldn't quit, but I had to find out if God was real. So I continued to smoke, and I blew the smoke out the window. And while I was in the dorm, and had a whole bunch of students coming, rushing to my door, thinking that I had set the place on fire. And I had to tell the truth, that I was smoking, and that it wasn't the dorm, it was me. And so my Bible college experience was not great, to say the least. But I did get straight A's in the classes. Bible and theology came relatively easy to me. I took hermeneutics, how to interpret scripture. And I learned quite a bit, but again, it was just head knowledge. My heart was still confused and depressed and anxious, guilty, scared, and lonely. Not a very good place to be as a believer, now supposedly transferred into the kingdom of heaven. Well, I wasn't finding any kind of heaven on earth with believers. I felt very much outside, like an outsider. What I didn't really know at that time was that my parents had just finalized their divorce, and in spite of my prayer for salvation, everything was still going south, and basically to hell in a handbasket. So I came back to my dad, who was now living on his own in Woodside, Queens, and I decided that I would live with him for as long as he would let me, and tried to continue to figure out where God was in all of this mess that I was experiencing in my life. I began watching the 700 Club daily. The only thing I did was watch the 700 Club and smoke marijuana. Now, isn't that a great way to find God? It felt good. But I got to tell you that it was, no, I did inhale. And then smoke cigarettes on top of that. When you smoke pot, the way that you get the most out of it is you inhale deeply. And so I inhaled as deeply as I could, held the smoke in as long as I could, and then exhaled, and then smoked cigarettes on top of that. So after a while, I had this horrendous cough. And I really thought that my lungs were being shredded. And I was coughing constantly, but I was just looking for some way to find relief from this anxiety, this tension, this stress that I was constantly feeling, that my life is being pressured by. So as I'm watching the 700 Club one fateful day, they have this portion where they're praying for the audience, and they said, hey, there's somebody out in television land that's watching, and they're being healed of cancer. They're being healed from a stroke. They're being healed in their finances. They're being healed in their relationships, whatever it is. And they would have people come on the program and say, yeah, it was me. I was healed. So I'm beginning to think, wow, if God is really alive and he's healing people, maybe I should get some of that. If he's really there, if he really can be trusted, if he's really healing, if he's really involved in the lives of people, if he knows who I am, well then maybe he can heal me. Because I'm so confused in my life at that point. I knew it was going to take a miracle from God if I was ever going to get everything straight. And so I began to pray that God, if he was real, if you are real, Lord, as you say you are, and as the Bible promises that you are, and if you really are an ever-present help in time of need, and if you are doing healings and miracles today, I want to know. Show me, now. Placing a demand on God can be a little bit risky, maybe even a little bit dicey, but I was desperate, so I didn't really care. It was like, okay, God, now you have to show me somehow, because I've tried the best of my ability and it's not working. So I put out my joint, and as I'm watching the program, he said, there's somebody out there who's very, very confused. And as they're praying, that got my attention right away. He's very depressed. It's like a dark cloud of depression and oppression is over his life. He's at odds with all the members of his family. My dad was threatening, actually, at that time to throw me out, and if I wasn't going to leave his apartment, he was going to call the cops on me, which was going to be doing me a big favor in his mind, which he was actually right about. But they seemed to be speaking to me, and they went on. His lungs are shredded. If he doesn't stop smoking, he's going to get emphysema. But if you just come to me, I will heal you, give you the desires of your heart, and your name is Mark. Well, that got my attention. Well, being the skeptic I was, and I had a lot of reasons to be skeptical. I had tried Christianity, I'd gone to Bible college, I had tried to interact with Christians, I had tried the best I could to try to understand intellectually what was going on with God, if he really was there and if he was trusted. So, being the skeptic I was, I said, God, if you're really saying this to me, would you please do it again? And I didn't really realize what I was doing. But I was testing God. I don't recommend it. He doesn't always respond well to that, but I think because I was so far out in left field and God was feeling so compassionate for my plight, he answered. And again, there's someone out there. It's as if they have brain damage. And this is something I could relate to because I felt so confused in my mind that I felt like I was damaged. I was so messed up. I felt like I had a brain tumor. And they said those very things. There's somebody that has brain damage. God is going to heal him. His name is Mark. And then again, and again, and again. What I didn't realize until years later was that they had described my situation to a T and called me out by name 30 times. What I've started to do, because of my scientific approach to everything, I was, in college I was a biology major and specialized in natural sciences and mathematics, and so my whole approach to this research project was, I'm going to get the data, I'm going to collect it, I'm going to put it on tape, I'm going to record it, and I'm going to have proof that what I'm hearing is really God. So I collected all this on tape. And then later on, I put it on CD, 5 CDs that show all these words of knowledge calling me out. That was going to, and promising me that I was going to be healed. I didn't experience that right away, but what it did do for me was it convinced me that God was real. I remember being so overwhelmed with anxiety over the fact that God seemed to be speaking to me that I turned off the 700 Club and would turn on the radio and I would come on the old Coke commercial. It's the real thing. I couldn't escape God. He was like a hound dog. He had my number. He was after me. And it was, at times, very overwhelming. But I needed to be convinced even further, if you can imagine. It says in Scripture that sometimes a Jew requires a sign. Okay, well, I had the sign, but my heart still was in trouble. But I discovered soon after that, through the providence of God, that you could be Jewish and be a believer in Jesus at the same time. That was a problem from the very start. I didn't realize that I was under what was really like a delusion, that you couldn't be Jewish and a believer in Jesus at the same time. So I was always kind of in conflict over believing in him, believing in Jesus as the promised Messiah of Israel. And because of that conflict, I was always saying yes, no, yes, no, yes, no to God, and I was very double-minded, and that was going to haunt me for years. I didn't realize that I was so double-minded about it until later on, but, and I'll tell you a little bit about that in a minute, but when I discovered Jews for Jesus, I discovered that the animosity between Jew and Gentile was resolved. The middle wall of partition was taken down. There was no reason for a Jewish person that really knew the truth about who Jesus was and the fulfillment of prophecy and everything that was connected to him to keep a Jewish person from believing in him as Messiah, as Lord. And so I began to really resolve that conflict through my interaction with Jews for Jesus, and it wasn't long after that that I was introduced to the Messianic movement. The Messianic movement is basically an attempt to show unsaved Jewish people that you can believe in Jesus as a Jew, and it doesn't mean you're betraying your people. It doesn't mean that you're turning your back on your heritage or your culture or your identity. You're not becoming meshumad, which means a traitor. And it's an expression of true Jewish believing faith. And so you can maintain your Jewish identity, enjoy the Jewish culture, history, and music as a believer in Jesus. And so for me, it was liberating. I could discover that I could be myself as a Jew and not have to become converted into something else. That meant a lot to me, personally. And I felt that I was for the first time in my life, that I was finding a completion rather than a contradiction in my faith. So that helped me a great deal. And then in the Messianic movement that I started to attend in 1985 called Beth Messiah in Livingston, New Jersey, I discovered even more that I was really accepted in the Lord, and I began to experience His grace in a way that I never had before. I became a member of the worship team. I became one of the teaching staff in the congregation, and I began to progress in my faith. It wasn't long after that I decided that I would go to CBN, the Christian Broadcasting Network Graduate School for Biblical Counseling, in the late 80s. And so I had to finish my college education. I had gone to 10 different colleges trying to figure out if God was real and what the meaning and purpose of life was. And I didn't really have enough credits at any particular school to graduate. So I ended up having to go to what they called an external degree program. I sent all my credits into a school that had this offering. And I was able to get my ticket to ride to go to CBN as a graduate student. And after completing my education there, I went, well, almost completing it all except the final paper, I decided I needed to go on to another school, Western Conservative Baptist Seminary out in Portland, Oregon, where I took a degree in clinical psychology and then ultimately a doctorate in clinical psychology, like my mother. But the benefit of this particular program was that you were able to integrate psychology and the Bible together. And that was something that I was really longing for. All truth is God's truth. I wanted to know the truth, so here was an opportunity for me to learn even more. But I was not, in spite of all the progress I was making in my faith, I had not arrived by a long shot, and was still haunted by my past, by the dysfunction in my family. I had less than an ideal self-image and self-esteem. And yet, God was gracious. He began to move providentially in my life once again and introduced me to my wife through a friend at a conference in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I had been going to conferences, Messianic conferences, looking for a Jewish believing wife. It seemed like a good idea. If you want to find fish, go where the fish are. So that's what I was doing. I was fishing, and conference after conference after conference, I never found a wife. But then one fateful day at another conference, I was tapped on the shoulder by an old friend, and she said, there's a girl I'd like you to meet. She's a believer, she's Jewish, she lives in Ohio, but I don't know if she's still single, but if she is, would you be interested in giving her a call? And I said, well, I've been on blind dates, I'm not really too up on that anymore. But I said, sure, why not? Because I knew who she was, and she probably wouldn't steer me wrong. But sight unseen, a few weeks later, I got a call saying she was available, she'd be interested in getting a call from me, so I called her up and discovered that she was, really, it seemed a lot of what I was looking for. She read a lot of the same books I had read. She was from a family like mine, a Jewish family. She had immigrated from Russia when she was 11 years old in 1981. And she was finding her way also, the same way I was, on the same journey toward the destination of knowing God and finding a better life, the abundant life. We didn't really know what we were searching for, but it really was the abundant life that Jesus promised that He came to give us in John 10:10. So it seemed almost too good to be true. Finally, I met a Jewish girl that's kind of like me, that's interested in pursuing the relationship. So sight unseen, I still never had a picture of her. I was calling her just about every day and developing the relationship. And I went to, finally, after several months, out to Ohio, met her. And on the plane ride, I still hadn't really seen what she looked like. But I was convinced that she was the one that God wanted me to marry. So I, with a little bit of encouragement from a friend of mine that said, don't worry, she's not a dog, Coming from him, it actually meant something to me. I was really, whoever said, life is a faith walk wasn't kidding. And in that case, it was not a cakewalk either, because I was really trusting that my friend wasn't going to steer me wrong. I was so convinced that this was the one, in a sense, that I said to her on the phone before I took the plane out there that for her not to be the one, she would have to be a barking animal. And she wasn't too impressed by that. While on the plane flying out to Ohio, I ran into a believer who wanted to find out more about me and about why I was going out to Ohio. And I said to this lady that I was going out to Ohio to meet someone that I'd never seen before, but I really felt God was leading me to marry. And she said, "Oh, that's really, really cool. Can I watch?" And I said, "Well, sure." What I didn't realize, though, was that she was part of an entourage of Promise Keepers and had 20 friends. And so when I came off the plane, she told her friends what was going on, and they wanted to all come and watch too. So I came out into the waiting area with 20 people and did sort of like a casual walk through the waiting area, and I zeroed in on Julie, who would later become my wife, and I knew it had to be her because she was the only one there. But I didn't have a picture of her either. But when I finally came up to her, I said, "You must be Julie." And she said, "Yes, I am." And everyone there just kind of sighed and went, "Oh." God was very gracious. But I have to tell you, it's not been a smooth road. It's been a very rocky road. It seemed like God was moving in ways that I never imagined He would. He was showing me His love, His grace, His mercy, His faithfulness, His goodness. But I was still in turmoil internally, in spite of all the ways that God was providing for me, protecting me, and leading me. And I began to really question whether God was on my side at times, because it wasn't maybe 5 years into my marriage that we decided we were going to move to Texas. And it's been about 8 years of time since we've moved here. And it was not a grease slide into heaven by any means. It was not a bowl of cherries here in Texas. What I discovered was that as I was trusting in God, that there were certain challenges I was going to have to face, including the loss of all of my finances in the stock market, and the birth of a new pastime, which was drinking vodka in order to medicate myself, to feel good. It was an old way that I used to try to feel better, and it was just a very easy thing for me to get into. And I'm being brutally honest with you, it just seemed like that was more important than God, even in spite of how God had been so good to me. So I became confused again. I was 1 foot in the world, 1 foot in the kingdom. I began to really struggle with my walk, and it was because of the financial pressures. I was having marital problems. I was having conflicts with my wife. We had 3 kids at that point. I knew that they were feeling it, and I hated the whole thing. I was looking for a way out. And I remembered all those words of knowledge that I had listened to on the 700 Club, where they called me out by name, promised healing. God said He was going to come through for me, not let me down. And so what I began to do was re-listen to a lot of those words, the promises that God made to me years earlier, literally more than 25 years ago. And this is several years ago from this point in time, but it seems like it was yesterday. I began to listen again, and I literally began to have a revelation of God's grace like I never saw before. I began to understand that God really did care about me, as a loving father cares about his kids, as a loving mother cares about her kids, that He was very interested in me. He knew everything about me. He knew the number of hairs on my head. He knew my getting up, my lying down, my going out, my coming in. He knew everything about me. And I was shocked that this whole experience was sort of put on the back burner and forgotten about for many, many years. But what it did was it recharged my faith. And I began to strongly pursue the transformation that God promises in His Word through the renewing of our minds. In Romans 12:1 and 2, we're invited to present our bodies as a living sacrifice and to be transformed through the renewing of our minds. And I began to realize as a psychologist that that was something that I had never really done. I had never really been renewed in my mind. And I was still under the influence of old ways of thinking, stinking thinking. You might have heard that phrase, very commonly used in the 12-step programs and at Celebrate Recovery. And I was very much under the influence of stinking thinking, not only stinking thinking, but stinking attitudes, stinking habits, stinking behavior, habits, and ways of relating. I was anything but renewed, even though I was walking with the Lord for many years at this point. I needed to understand that renewal was something that I could pursue, and that's why I mentioned before that life is not just a journey, it's a destination. Renewal became my goal. Regeneration, renewal, there are a lot of terms for it in Scripture, but it all became possible through reconciliation with the God of Shalom. And I began to understand peace, and shalom in the Bible is a very robust theological and psychological term. It's not just hi and goodbye that, you hear a lot of people in Israel, a lot of Jewish people in Israel say shalom to one another as they greet and as they leave each other. But it means much more than that. It's a term that refers to well-being in every area, every relationship that you have. It's well-being in your finances. It's well-being mentally, emotionally, relationally. It's well-being everywhere in your life. It's the abundant life. And shalom became the goal. But how to actually achieve that always seemed to elude me. But then what I finally discovered was that it was by becoming more like Yeshua, Jesus, that the experience of shalom, the promise of the abundant life, could and began to become a reality for me. It wasn't before I began to really pursue transformation through the renewal of the mind that the thing that I was longing for and looking for all my life began to take on form and began to become something that was real. Before then, my relationship with God was really superficial and weak and didn't make a whole lot of sense at times. And I realized that I was really almost like a project waiting to happen. I had to have this revelation of God's grace. And that's what those words of knowledge of the 700 Club provided me. And I discovered, in my pursuit of freedom and victory over the things that were dogging me for years, like I said, low self-esteem, getting into all kinds of mischief and problems and vodka, you name it, I began to experience a transformation of my image of myself. I didn't see myself quite the same way as I had in the past. God, through His grace, began to transform my self-image. Self-image became a very critical concept for me to understand as a psychologist, as it applied to me. I didn't believe I was worthy. I didn't believe that I deserved God's love because of the way that I was living. I didn't believe that I was competent and capable and adequate. I felt inferior and very easily offended and hurt because I was always looking to please people and wanted to be loved and accepted by them and never seemed to be. That was my constant experience of life. So I was living in shame, guilt, and fear. I was very angry about it all. And this went on for years until God began to catch me on this subject of self-image. What I discovered is that our identity, our very being, is transformed by God's power. We become a new creation. It says in Scripture that the old passes away and everything becomes new. I didn't begin to learn that until I was walking with the Lord for 25, 30 years. But thankfully, God was very merciful because He could have taken me out at any point in time. I could have crashed my car under the influence. I could have ruined my marriage beyond repair. I could have overdosed on LSD or cocaine. There are many ways that Satan could have destroyed me, and I believe it was only because God was protecting me that I didn't die along the way. But I realized, as I was studying self-image and I was starting to experience this freedom, that this double-mindedness that I referred to before as a Jew went deeper than just in terms of my Jewish identity. I also needed to know that I was clearly a son of the Most High God, that I was His child, that He was a loving Father and He loved me. And so, as I began to see that, I stopped going back and forth. Does God love me? Doesn't He love me? Maybe He does, maybe He doesn't. I'm forgiven, I'm not forgiven. I can live in the world or live in the kingdom. Live in between if I can, or if I dare, or live back and forth again. I was constantly up and down, back and forth, and in a state of confusion because I wasn't wholeheartedly committed to God. I had not first accepted the truth, and then I wasn't living the truth, and I knew I was a hypocrite, and I at times had relief by living a lie, but ultimately the lies were killing me. And so this is one of the things I wanted to share this morning, is that you don't have to live on the basis of lies. The truth is liberating. The Bible says that if you continue in my word, you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. I never knew that. Truth liberates. It's because of the truth of who God is and His love for us that we can really experience freedom in the presence of God. It says in Psalm 16:11, there is fullness of joy, pleasures forevermore, but real pleasure in life, not the fake counterfeit pleasures that we get from doing drugs or drinking or sexing, or for some people it's working and working out. It's a lot of different things for a lot of different people, but none of those things satisfy like a relationship with God, the Father, through His Son, and the relationship that He provides. So I stopped this craziness. It was a form of schizophrenia. I didn't know it, but I actually read later that it's called something. Spiritual schizophrenia. By definition, schizophrenia, and I'm telling you this as a psychologist, is a break from reality. It's like a disconnect from what is true and what is real. And schizophrenia is pathological. But you know what I've discovered as a psychologist now in practice for 20 years, is that a lot of believers are schizophrenic, just like I was. A lot of believers struggle really believing and understanding that God is a loving Father, and He gave everything when He laid His life down through His Son. He said, no greater love has any man than this, than he that is willing to lay his life down for his friends. And this is what I call you, my friends. I didn't understand the sacrificial, unconditional love and grace of God for years as a believer. It's taken me a long time to even begin to grasp. And even now, we see through a glass darkly. I know I don't fully grasp it, but I'm not where I used to be. And I'm on my way, and it's getting better and better. I just have to thank God, that He was merciful. I began to understand that there's a process involved in transformation that I could engage in deliberately on purpose. And it's basically three things. To recognize the lies, to begin to reject them, and then to replace them with the truth. That process is something that we can engage in on purpose. And so for me, as a psychologist, as a minister now, I'm associated with Christ for the Nations. It's become even a deeper revelation that we don't have to be victims of the past. A lot of people believe that emotions, for example, just kind of happen to you. I feel any which way. And it's because of the environment or what other people say or do. I feel the way that I feel. And I can't really change that. And it's not because of me, it's because of what's going on around me. You take two people on a jet plane and there's turbulence, severe turbulence, and one person is saying, this is normal, it will pass, and they order a drink, open the newspaper, and they just relax. Another person thinks the engine's going to fly off the side of the plane because they haven't experienced turbulence, and they think about it in a different way. Well, the truth is that emotions are chosen by us. We choose our feelings. We choose our thoughts. We choose our attitudes. I didn't know that. I can choose my thoughts. That was a revelation. I didn't have to think the same old way, do things the same old way, expecting different results, and continue to be psychotic, expecting that life is going to be better. I had to change before I was going to get better. I had to choose a different way of thinking. I had to choose a different way of feeling and behaving. But as, by the grace of God, I've been able to think the way the Bible teaches about myself and about relationships, I've been able to discover this new creation sort of a lifestyle, which is a lifestyle of Jesus himself. And it's been made available to all. All who call on the name of the Lord will be saved. So I praise God that the truth of who we are in Him is the way to victory and freedom in life. I have experienced now greater and greater measures of shalom. And as time has gone on, it's become not only something that I am grateful now to experience, but that I feel called upon by the Lord to share now with others this liberation, if you will, the victory that we have in Christ, through Christ. I started a ministry called Heart of Shalom Ministries, and the purpose of it is to facilitate shalom and effective relationships in the lives of all who are ministered to. And so the ministry started at the end of last year, and it's growing. I did a seminar up in New York just a week ago that was well received. Apparently there are a lot of believers that struggle just the way that I did, and I'm praying that God will use this ministry to help people enter into the freedom and the victory that Jesus died to provide for us. In Romans 8:28 and Jeremiah 29:11, there's the promise that God works all things together for good to those who love Him, and that He will provide shalom. He will provide peace. He knows the plans He has for us, not for calamity, but for shalom. Shalom is a very big word in the Bible. It's mentioned over 250 times. It's big on God's radar. I never knew that. But this is the reason for the season. He didn't come to judge and to condemn, but to show the way to peace. He came as a peacemaker. Blessed are the peacemakers. He came to create peace between Jew and Gentile and to establish peace on the earth. The reason most Jewish people reject Him as Messiah is because He didn't do that the first time He came. But He's coming again. And He's going to fulfill all those many hundreds of prophecies pertaining to His second coming. He's going to establish His kingdom on earth, and there will be peace, referred to as the millennium, that will last for 1,000 years, and then beyond that into eternity. So the question is, are we all ready for that? Are we ready for His coming? That's a question, I think, that needs to be asked. Are you struggling? Do you have a lack of freedom, a lack of victory in your life? Is there a habit that dogs you, that you can't seem to shake? Well, I invite you to come to the Liberator. It's Yeshua, the true Messiah of the living God. If anyone comes to Him, any of you come to Him looking for freedom, the path to transformation He has made available, but we have to take that path. I love to read this poem because it speaks to my heart about the journey I referred to before of life. I think it's more than just a journey, it's a destination also. And this really captures it. Scene 1. I walk down the street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I fall in. I'm lost. I'm helpless. It's not my fault. It takes forever to find a way out. Scene 2. I walk down the same street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I pretend I don't see it, and I fall in again. I can't believe I'm in the same place, but it's not my fault. It still takes a long time to get out. I walk down the same street again, and there's still a deep hole in the sidewalk. I see it there. I still fall in. Now it's a habit, but my eyes are open, and I know where I am. It is my fault, and I get out immediately. Scene 4. I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I choose to walk around it. Scene 5. I walk down another street. Praise God. If he can change me, he can change anyone. If you put your faith in him, draw near to him, he will not disappoint you. He didn't disappoint me, and he is faithful to complete the good work that he has begun in each and one of our lives. By his grace and by his mercy, he is faithful. Thank you for this opportunity to share my story. May God richly bless you all today, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thank you.